Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Regulatory Dialogue at CERAWEEK. My name is Phillips. I head up the Gas, Power, and Climate team for S&P Global Commodity Insights, and I'm thrilled to be with you here today. At CERAWEEK every year, we have themes that develop throughout the week. And I think one of the big themes this year, and new terminology for us, is the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. We've heard all sorts of commentary how this could be I think the quote was a game changer in our move to energy transition, developing lower carbon resources. We heard from John Podesta talked about it. We heard from Secretary Granholm was exhorting us to be leaders in this area. And I'm sure tomorrow, when Dan is speaking with Senators Murkowski and Manchin, we'll hear about permitting reform, because that came up as a potential Achilles heel. But today, I'm super happy to be joined by Willie Phillips, who's chair of the FERC. FERC, of course, regulatory body for our infrastructure, cross-state infrastructure, as well as wholesale markets. Chairman Phillips has been with the FERC since 2001. 2001, assumed the chair role this January. Formerly a state regulator, as well as working for the North America Electric Reliability Corporation. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's start off with, as the chairman, what are your priorities now for FERC?
Well, first of all, again, thank you so much for having me. This has been a fantastic conference. I can't say enough good things about Houston. In particular, I want to mention the Houston Police Department and all the support that they've given us throughout the week. To answer your question about my priorities, I announced as soon as I was nominated or designated by the president that my priorities are reliability. I think grid security is a part of that, transmission reform, and environmental justice. And I think it's worth just taking like a little bit of a step back and thinking about those priorities in the larger context of what I think the priorities are for FERC as a whole. You know, there are reliability, affordability, and sustainability. But we can all agree on this, I think, that doing big things and building things like new energy infrastructure is something that we're all in agreement on and focused on.
So what is in terms of specifically electric transmission, what are in the FERC's toolbox to help in that area?
You know, I've said before that we're pulling every possible lever at FERC to make sure that transmission reform is not just rhetoric, but something that we can actually get done. We have a number of different rulemakings and proposals that are on the table. I think that we're trying to deal with the reality on the ground to make sure that we talk about long-term regional planning for transmission. I think even more importantly, probably more urgently, interconnection queue reform is something that I'd like to see us address. Right now, we know we have so many projects, clean energy projects, that are waiting in the queue. And we know that only about 80% of those projects are actually being built right now. If we can unlock that bottleneck, I think we can go a long way to achieving our goals.
One of the things you've talked about also is trying to balance speed with legal durability. What does that mean?
You know, it's something I hear a lot about. You may have noticed since I took over the chairmanship that we've looked for some opportunities to increase the efficiency of our internal processes, especially when you talk about certificating new projects, gas pipeline projects. We found that there were a lot of projects that were waiting and sitting for quite a while. And so what we've tried to do, and you can't cut corners here. You have to make sure that you dot every I, cross every T when it comes to environmental review. Again, environmental justice concerns and impacts, doing all of that, but you do it in a way where you can make sure that when projects are ready, when they're ready for a vote and they're ready to be moved out, that you can go ahead and do that. I think that providing that certainty to the industry as a regulator is a responsibility.
And you've already done that, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think what we've done is we've tried to, based upon the advice I've gotten from my staff. You know, Stacy Steep is in the chairman's office. She, working with our projects team, we're looking at each and every project in a way that we can move it. I'm glad to say, in an accelerated way. I've directed our staff to make sure that we don't sit on our hands, that we move projects forward.
So right now, you're sitting at 4 commissioners, and it's majority, right? Is that a problem, or how do you handle that?
You know, I actually think it's an opportunity. I think conventional wisdom would say that things are two, and that they're divided, and that all of these grand ideas that I have about environmental justice and getting projects moved out, we can't do it. I think it's an opportunity for us to show that we can build consensus, that we can compromise, that we can do things that are bipartisan. And I think that when you do things like that, you come out with a result that is more durable, that is possibly long-lasting. If you're doing things with one party all the time, when the new administration comes in, if there is one, then they can just flip that call whenever they get ready. But if you do something where you're doing it together, I think that's the certainty. That's being consistent as a regulator that our stakeholders are looking for, and I think that's what ticks off all of those values we talked about: reliability, affordability, sustainability.
Now, how about between federal and state? You have a task force, you're a former state regulator. How's that moving along?
Again, I mean, one of the first things I did when I took over the chairmanship was to announce that we're going to continue a joint state-federal task force, especially on transmission reform. Jason Stanek, the chair of the Maryland Commission, he's the co-chair of that task force. It is an opportunity for us to hear directly from our state regulators. And as a former state regulator, I can tell you this: I know how important and valuable it is to have your voice heard, when it comes to these issues like transmission, when there's so much overlap. There's so much cross-jurisdictional functions that come to bear on the issue of moving and building new infrastructure. I think it's critical that we have a dialogue with our states.
So will that task force, does it have an end?
You know, we don't have an end in mind. I think as long as it has value, I think right now it has great value. What we talked about in February, we had the meeting at the CERAWEEK meeting in February in Washington, D.C. We talked about physical security and how transmission planning can be used to address some of the physical security threats that we've seen recently, both in North Carolina, Washington State, and several different places across the grid.
Okay, well, that's a great transition, thank you. That's where I was going next.
All right.
Resilience. We've seen those attacks, it's made the news. What can FERC do to help in this area?
This is something, I think, because of my experience at NERC, I view so many of the issues that we have at FERC now through the prism of reliability and resilience. We have a two-pronged approach, of course, when it comes to cybersecurity, and physical security is a part of cybersecurity, I think. We have mandatory critical infrastructure protection reliability standards. Those are drafted with NERC. They're built, building consensus with the stakeholders. Given to FERC, we can approve them, we can add to them $1 million per day per violation. I mean, they're strong standards, but they're the floor. They're not the ceiling. And so the other thing that we do is we work with our partners. We work with our sister agencies, DOE, DHS, CISA. We also work with the states. We can go into utilities and do audits. We can do tabletops exercises to try to identify lessons learned and push out that guidance. We're also working right now on incentives for cybersecurity measures. And also just when it comes to the physical security threat, making sure that everyone knows that this is a top priority. And again, lessons learned, making sure that we push those out through the different mechanisms that we have to make sure that utilities know what the best practices are.
So you focus on both, and you've talked about prevention as well as recovery. Do you focus on both areas as equally, or?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, when you talk about physical security, you don't have to look any further than what's happened in Europe. And you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how Russia has used cybersecurity, they attempted to use cybersecurity as a weapon there. It's everyone agrees that just as soon as there's no longer a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Russia's going to turn those cyber weapons on the United States and our allies. We have no choice but to be prepared to make sure that we're ready to identify, respond, and recover to any potential threats. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. But I can tell you right now, we're working diligently with our partners, meeting all the time on these issues. And every single month since I've joined the commission, since I've been named chair, we've tried to make sure that we prioritize these issues in our open meeting and in the actions that we take.
Let's go back to another topic at one of your priorities, which is environmental justice. What does that mean for FERC and for you?
Environmental justice to me is something that's foundational. This is personal to me. I grew up in Alabama on the Gulf Coast. I grew up in the environmental justice community. I come from a large family. I saw firsthand how my family struggled to take part in some of the industries that surrounded our community. And so that experience has impacted me profoundly on how I view the issue of environmental justice and equity, quite frankly. But the point here is not that we use these issues as a wedge. I think that it also is an opportunity for us to address environmental justice impacts early in any type of process that we have, any type of application or proceeding. If we do it early, then we can avoid costly delays and litigation on the back end of a potential project. You asked earlier about speed, right? The shortest timeline on any project is the timeline that doesn't include a remand or reversal on appeal. I don't want to see our projects just get approved. I don't want to see them just get certificated and not be built. If they're needed for reliability, if they're needed for sustainability, we need to make sure that they're ultimately successfully built. That's why addressing environmental justice up front is so important.
Is that stakeholder engagement, outreach, all of the above?
Absolutely. I mean, people ask me, companies often ask me, what do you mean? Like, how do you do engagement on environmental justice? Mm-hmm. And this is what I say. I would start with asking the community. Mm-hmm. Ask the community what they need. And then if you don't know, I can tell you from my own personal experience, there's nothing more important than a job. Making sure that if you can't hire people in the community, train them, and they can take those talents other places, to other companies. And if you give people work, if you give them a job, it can change a family. It can change a community. It can change the trajectory of a career. And the reason why I know that, because that's what happened to me.
Let's change topics one more time. Any technologies that FERC, I know you don't focus on technologies, but are there technologies that you're looking at following?
I can nerd out on this subject all day long. Grid enhancing technologies is something that I talk about a lot. I think that's a part of transmission reform. When you talk about stuff like dynamic line ratings, we had a proceeding where we directed utilities to consider dynamic line ratings, ambient adjusted ratings, reconductoring of existing transmission facilities and lines. I mean, the ability, that not only is something that we can use to help get to where we're going with our goals, but it also can save customers costs in the long run, because if we can't do this affordably, we will not do it successfully.
So we're seeing, whether it's the IRA at the federal level, which is a lot of intervention, we're also seeing at the state level support for renewables, RPS standards, support for nuclear. As we're seeing more and more intervention, are we moving away from the historical least cost sort of expansion and operation of our infrastructure?
That's an interesting question. I think there are a lot of different drivers when it comes to our market. I think a part of that, of course, is policy. I think that states and Congress is well within, their purview, their right to put forward the policy issues and legislation that they feel that their constituents elected them to do. When it comes to FERC and how we view the markets, our responsibility is to make sure we have just and reasonable rates, to make sure that the markets send the proper signals, to make sure that we have proper resource adequacy and capacity on the system, especially when it comes to stuff like extreme weather. That's why we recently, since I've become chairman, we've announced that we're going to look at capacity markets within PJM. We're going back to New England to talk about their resource adequacy issues and really, quite frankly, inability to build infrastructure to address those issues in New England. We're doing both of those this summer. These are things that I think that FERC should be focused on. I'll stay out of the lane of the politicians and let them handle their part.
So extreme weather it's on the radar and it's...
Absolutely. I think that as a regulator, if you look at the recent storms that we've had, Winter Storm Elliott, Winter Storm Uri, I know FERC has an ongoing inquiry with NERC right now on Elliott. We've tried to implement some of the recommendations from Winter Storm Uri. Again, this comes back to reliability and resilience. It touches on all the core values that we've talked about. A big part, though, of addressing extreme weather, I believe, is inter-regional transfer capability and capacity. If you look at sort of what a lot of people say saved us when you come to some of these recent storms, has been the ability for regions that have excess capacity to actually share that capacity with regions that are having constraints. And so this is something we've had a technical conference on last fall. In 2023, I'd like to make sure that FERC continues to focus on that issue and make some significant ground.
So this connects back to the resilience and making the grid hardier, building it out, connecting the regions.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, we can talk about what our priorities are. I think that reliability has to be job number one. And sort of to underscore that a little bit, one thing that we did with NERC is that we asked NASB to look at the issue of gas-electric coordination, which is something that the industry has been talking about for a very long time. But what we've seen NASB do is they've had, I believe, 7 monthly meetings talking about this issue. And when you think about extreme weather, there's a bit of a thread that has appeared. You look at, for example, long weekends, holiday weekends. Labor Day weekend, there was an issue in California. Christmas Eve, there was another issue in North Carolina. I believe it was North Carolina. We have to be able to schedule, we have to be able to deploy our resources in a way that can meet the needs over a long weekend. We hope to get recommendations from NASB on these issues, and as soon as we do, I'll turn to my colleagues and I'll try to prioritize those to see what we can get done to push forward the issue of gas-electric coordination.
Is there a federal-state difference there, or?
I think one of the things I've noticed from our joint federal-state task force is that on issues that you think there would be some type of tension, oftentimes when you get in the room, and this is the beauty of dialogue, this is the beauty of convening people. When you get them in the room, you have folks who care about some things, right? You have folks that care a lot about grid security, reliability on one side. You have people that care a lot, about clean energy and the transition. And they're talking about these things differently. But at the end of the day, it's really, I think we have an opportunity to solve for the same problems. It happens all the time. People say the same thing about a divided FERC. We're supposed to live in a divided country right now. We're supposed to have a divided Congress. I think that when it comes to doing big things, things that matter, we're not as far apart as our politics might suggest.
Well, Chairman Phillips, you've done a great job laying out your priorities, bringing people together, safe, reliable markets, and we really appreciate you coming and visiting with us here at CERAWEEK. We hope to see you again next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. The plenary program will resume shortly on level 4 of the Hilton.